Back in March, I decided to put my woodworking skills to the test and set out to make some built-in cabinets for Aaron's office that will still allow him to utilize his standing desk while adding storage. Aaron has had his uplift adjustable standing desk for a while now. It allows him to raise it and use it as a standing desk or lower it and work at a chair. Because the desk needs to be able to function at two different heights, building cabinetry or built-ins around it creates an interesting woodworking challenge. Also, the space is really tight. It's a small office and there's only a few feet on either side of the desk, so I need to build cabinets with a small enough footprint. I want the cabinetry to surround the desk to help the desk visually feel more integrated in the room and less like a floating object up against a blank wall, but it needs to leave enough clearance to raise the desk when he's standing. I came up with a design that utilizes 3 cabinets to surround the desk on one side and from above. Based on my plans, I'll need 3 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. I got my plywood for this build from Anderson Plywood here in LA. If you live in the Los Angeles area, I highly recommend giving them a try. It was one of my most pleasant lumber buying experiences. They have a huge selection of plywoods and even some hardwood lumber. Plus the staff is helpful, friendly, and doesn't make you feel like an idiot for being a newbie woodworker. As with all plywood projects, the first challenge is getting the 4x8 foot boards into our tiny shop. I decided to go with cherry veneered plywood for this build. I originally wanted to use walnut, but when I planned it all out, it severely murdered the budget, so I decided I'd use something less expensive and stain it a dark brown to at least achieve a similar look. In order to make things more manageable in a small shop, I always like to start by rip cutting the sheets with my track saw down to a rough dimension first. If you're new to our channel, welcome! I'm Daniel and my husband Aaron and I have been working for the past 3 years to rebuild our old house into the home of our dreams. If you're curious about what we've done so far, consider heading over to our website where you can access all of our videos and also sign up for our newsletter and join our growing community so you can stay updated on all our latest posts. With so many pieces needed to complete this build, it's important to always label everything. I also include on my labels a note when something is rough cut, so I know it's not yet down to its final dimension. I like to use my table saw to cut the pieces down to their final dimensions. I just find it gets things dialed in more precisely than the track saw, and cabinets need to be precisely cut in order to fit together properly. I'll be starting with the lower cabinet, which is a small 3-drawer cabinet that will ultimately have a taller cabinet attached on top of it. If my shop were bigger, I might have made this whole unit one piece, but for ease of build and install, I'll be making them as 2 separate pieces and trying my best to hide the seam. Now I know using the Festool domino tool is a highly controversial topic and makes this project no longer attainable for beginning woodworkers, but everything I'm doing here with dominoes can easily be done with pocket hole screws. In fact, I made our entire kitchen with pocket hole screws years ago before I had a domino tool, and those cabinets have been holding up really well. But since I now have the good fortune of owning one, I figured I might as well use it. The joints will be strong and easy to make. Okay, enough apologizing for dominoes. I'm making these cabinets with a full 3/4 inch back panel. I've made cabinets with thinner backs before, but I do like the rigidity the extra thickness provides, and also, given the number of sheets I had to buy, it was no added expense to do it this way. All 4 sides of the cabinet carcass will have a rabbet or rebate, depending on where in the world you are, that the back panel will slip into. I started by adding a groove to each piece at the table saw. This is where that rabbet will terminate. Then I cut out the rest of the recess at the router table. With all my pieces prepped, it was time to assemble the cabinet carcass. For the drawers, I bought some thinner Baltic birch plywood that came pre-finished, which will save time and money. I won't go into a whole lesson on how to build drawers because there's already hundreds of videos available on that topic. I decided to keep mine simple. This is going to be used for mostly light office supplies, and I don't need them to be insanely heavy duty. For the drawer fronts, I used more of my 3/4 inch cherry with some matching edge banding. This type of edge banding has a heat activated glue on it, so I have an old demoted iron that I keep in the shop for this sort of thing. You do want to make sure to press it down well and roll over it once you're done to make sure there's no gaps. I also like to run my edges through the router with a very subtle round over to clean up and soften the edges a bit, but you can also just do this with a sander. The drawer box is going to attach directly to the drawer front, so I used my table saw fence to set my depth and created a groove near the bottom of each drawer front with my handheld router. I also cut a similar groove into the 2 side pieces and back so that the 1/4 inch bottom panel can slide into them. Then I just assembled the drawers with glue and some pocket hole screws. Because there's a little wiggle room in the front pieces, I checked to make sure my reveal on either side was consistent before screwing it in place. To attach the drawer slides and drawer to the cabinet, I marked layout lines based on my plans for where I wanted the slider and the bottom of the drawer to land. There's many different ways to attach a drawer to a cabinet, including a very handy Craig jig that I have used before, but based on what I was trying to achieve here, I found it easier to use a scrap of wood cut to the proper size as a guide to install the sliders at the same height on each side. Attaching drawers and having everything line up and function properly is a challenge. My first couple of cabinets ended up with drawers that take a lot of manhandling to operate. It took me some time and experimenting to be able to get a drawer to operate smoothly. So I am planning on releasing a separate video that covers how I installed these drawers so I can take my time explaining my process to those who might be interested. So if this is something you're curious about, stay tuned. I'm hoping I can get to that soon. For now, we'll use the magic of motion picture editing to jump to a fully installed drawer. Moving on, the next part of the build is the tall cabinet that will sit on top of the lower I just built. It consists of a few shelves and 1 large door. I repeated many of the same steps here, cutting down the pieces to their final dimensions and adding my mortises before assembling the pieces. Attaching the final side of this cabinet was a bit tricky as it meant having to line up 12 dominoes at once before the glue dried. For the door, I used the Craig cabinet hinge jig. This thing is only like $30 and worth every penny. I used it more times than I can count, and it makes installing a concealed hinge a breeze. For cabinet doors, I usually install a hinge onto a scrap that I use as a jig to mark where the screw holes need to go on the cabinet carcass. Then I use the same relative placement I used on the scrap to lay out the hinges on the door itself. The last piece of the puzzle is the upper unit, and I purposely saved the hardest part for last. This one includes 4 equally sized bays, 1 with open shelving and 3 with doors. It will get mounted to the wall and the previous cabinet on the left, but since the right side is going to be totally exposed, I wanted to create a seamless look by mitering the edges of this side of the cabinet to create a sort of waterfall effect. At first, I attempted this with my track saw, which can cut at a 45-degree angle, but it proved awkward to say the least. And it's essential that these 4 mitered edges fit together perfectly. What I needed was a crosscut sled, which allows you to safely make crosscuts at the table saw. Now I have built at least 3 different crosscut sleds over the years that I used in the past to varying degrees of success, but none of them survived the move and construction we've been undergoing these past few years, and I don't have the energy or time to make another one. So I decided to do the most reasonable thing I could think of and throw money at the problem. Luckily, I found the Rockler crosscut sled on sale at the time, and with a store nearby it meant for around $100 I could have it right away and keep working. I have to say I didn't know what to expect at first, but I was pleasantly surprised. This thing is a huge time saver. It cuts at different angles and it's incredibly easy to adjust the fence to ensure you're perfectly aligned with your blade. I had it out of the box and working perfectly in about 10 minutes. My only regret was not buying it sooner. Next up, I had to cut mortises into the edges at a 45-degree angle. I've only done this once before and I blew through the piece, almost ruining it, so I did a little experimenting with some scrap wood before cutting into the actual workpiece. Each bay is going to have a sort of divider piece between them, so I marked out layout lines on the bottom piece and then lined the bottom up with the top piece to precisely transfer the layout lines to the top. This should ensure the shelves line up properly when it comes time to assemble. Then I cut out the grooves for the back panel and I was ready to assemble. Now I wish I had thought about it before, but at some point I realized I wanted to integrate some lighting into the cabinets to provide some desk light, so I decided to add an LED strip to the underside of this upper cabinet. To ensure the lighting remains flush with the cabinet and doesn't protrude out at all, I needed to route out a groove that will allow me to recess the LED lighting strip. It probably would have been easier to do this before the unit was fully assembled, but I made it work. Now that all three cabinets are assembled, it's time to deal with the face frame. While I used edge banding for the doors and drawers, I knew I wanted solid wood banding for the face frame. I also plan to add a bevel detail to add some depth and visual interest that I think will elevate the overall look of the built-ins, while still keeping it simple and modern. Luckily, I was able to find solid cherry wood at Anderson when I bought the plywood, and since I'll only be using it for the face frame, I don't need much of it. The lumber came planed on both faces, but with rough edges, and since I don't have a jointer, I used my track saw to shave off the roughness from one edge, and then set that newly cleaned up edge against my table saw fence to clean up the other edge. Then I ripped the board down to the size I need for my face frames, and used a chamfer bit at the router table to cut out the angled bevel. The corners of the face frame all need to be mitered to keep the bevel flowing seamlessly throughout the piece. When I do miters for frames, I usually like to sneak up on the cut to ensure a proper fit. So I did the same here, making my first cut a little off of my mark and slowly sneaking up on it until it fits just right. There's always room for error when marking cuts, so it's not always best practice to blindly trust your mark. Test fitting and cutting over and over again takes time, but it's what has worked for me in the past when precision matters. For the shelves and dividers, I used flat pieces of cherry to cover the edges, which was much easier. I purposely left my edge framing slightly thicker than the cabinet so I could flush trim it later and ensure a clean and flat look, but I realized that my router couldn't sit flat on the face frame because of the bevel, so I had to add a scrap of wood as a support rail to help keep the router from tilting as I make the cut. Of course, I didn't actually come to this realization until after doing some light damage to the cabinet, but nothing some wood filler couldn't fix. Cherry has a natural warm tone that can push it a little too close to orange when staining. I wanted a dark brown but without too much of an orange tint, so I did some experimenting with colors before committing to a stain. Since I will be using a water-based stain, I like to raise the grain of the wood first by dampening the surface and then lightly sanding. This prevents the stain from raising the grain and ensures a smooth to the touch finish. To seal each cabinet, I used my go-to Osmo hard wax. With the cabinets finished, it was time to install this built-in. In order to install the lower cabinet flush to the wall, I had to remove a piece of the baseboard. We attached each of the cabinets to studs in the wall and also to each adjoining cabinet, making sure to check for level and plumb as we went. When installing uppers, I like to add a ledger board to the wall that the cabinet can rest on. It makes it easier by alleviating some of the weight and also takes the guesswork out of leveling it, as long as you make sure your ledger board is completely level. Then we added the doors and drawers and we were done. If you have any comments or questions about this build, let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed watching, please consider liking and subscribing.